G'day and welcome to the Grow a Small Business Podcast. I'm your host, Troy Truen. Each week, we speak with an owner who has grown a business with 5 to 30 team members to something bigger. Diving into their numbers and unearthing the pain they've experienced, we explore what they did to overcome each barrier and what they would do differently from day one. Let's get into it.
So Karen, welcome to the podcast and thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Karen, I was really excited to have this conversation because the two areas that I've noticed that you focus on is communication and confidence. And as you mentioned, as we were talking just before, sometimes you blend them together to teach people how to communicate confidently, which I think is fantastic. And certainly in my mind, communication is one of the most important things that we do as business owners. We do it all day long. And it's really the one thing in whatever form we're communicating. It's the one tool we've got to actually influence what's going on around us and in our world. And again, there's lots of different ways to communicate, but I think the better we get at communicating, the more impactful we can be with what we're doing. And certainly from my experience, the whole piece around confidence is a massive one as well. So many business owners will at least have some moment of feeling as though I'm not good enough, or I don't have any right to ask this, or to reach out to this person to help me. And I think the more we can do to build the confidence of business owners, the better. So as far as the topic area goes, I'm super excited to hear a little bit more about what you're going to say. And I guess where we've sort of landed is that negotiation is one of the really important areas of communication that we could all do better in. And perhaps as a starting point, tell me a little bit about what is your definition of communication, and how does negotiation fit in as a subset of that?
Sure. Well, I have to start with a story because when I was 6 years old, my dad gave me a few dollars at a flea market and he said, "Go have fun, but never pay full price." And I will tell you that was a very powerful lesson in confident communication. And that's really where my love for the deal was born of, oh my gosh, you can actually negotiate. You don't have to just pay what's right there at face value. So when I think about communication, specifically the definition around it is really, number one, are we being clearly understood? I mean, at the end of the day, if we're not understanding each other, communication really hasn't taken place. And if I think about that, then, well, how do we remove any of the barriers possible that will take away from those distractions? So whether it's barriers, distractions, how can we make sure that our message is getting across in a way that is also how we intended? Because I'm sure you've had the experience, probably like the rest of the human race, where at one point you think you came across in a way or you intended something, and then the impact was very different because you find out later, wait, what? You thought that? No, that's not what I meant. Oh my gosh. How, in your head, you might be thinking, how could they have possibly misunderstood that? I was so clear. And that
I think I do that on
always have a job.
At least a daily basis.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I think for the most of us, right? So that's one of the things when you think about negotiating, it's like we were talking about offline, that so many people just don't bother to ask. Whether it's because they have some fear, or there's just simply some doubts. Well, what if people say no? How am I going to feel? And at the root of all of these things is that as human beings, we just want to be accepted. We don't want to have rejection. We don't want to have conflict. And I get all of that. And on the other hand, I have been really amazed, and I'm so grateful to my dad for teaching that skill in me at such an early age, because I have asked for a lot in my career, and a lot of the times I've gotten it. And that's why I feel like now I'm at a point in my career where, of course, I've been teaching this for a while too, of that there are really specific strategies to use that can make it a lot easier. But the first one is simply to make the actual ask.
So I guess how do you encourage people to take that first step? And this really comes down to the confidence piece, and whether that might be trying to talk to one of your employees about taking on more responsibilities, or talking to a customer about a price increase, or maybe you're asking an investor to put some money into your business. I mean, there's so many different situations, several times a day where I guess opportunities arise to ask for more for your business. But again, often people will struggle with the confidence around that. What help can you offer in that regard?
Sure. Well, the number one thing is always to know your audience. So the confidence comes from, number one, do you know who you're speaking to, and figure out what matters to them? How are you going to add value? Like whatever you're asking for, how can you position it in a way that adds value to them? And basically, I think the more candid conversation is, why would they care?
Yeah.
And I think about a couple of years ago, shortly after I went out on my own from the corporate world, and I was launching a summit. And at first I was thinking in my head, okay, I'm going to ask these very prominent women to see if I can get them on my summit to interview them. And at first it was, it's just what a lot of people think is just, I'm just going to ask, like, let's see what they say. So on one hand, that is fine. But on the other hand, what actually got people more interested was being a part of something bigger. So sometimes it's knowing your audience to know what is in it for them. And then an offshoot of that is the way that I shifted this communication. Instead of saying, do you want to be a part of this summit that I'm doing? It's really cool. Versus, do you want to be a part of a movement empowering women?
Wow.
It's such a different feel, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And so
Sign me up.
and I think especially, nowadays, even more than ever, as human beings, we've always wanted to make a difference. I firmly believe that that's a human thing, just in general, that we want to know that our life or our work has made a difference. But to think about, hey, this is actually where so many people are at now, and there's just so much more prominence around it in the world today, is that people want to have meaningful work. They want to, or just be a part of something bigger than themselves, whether that's talking to your employees about what motivates them, or whether it is clarifying what your why or your purpose is, because that's a whole other conversation. But I'm amazed at how many business owners and their teams don't always align on what their key results or objectives are for the year. But a lot of times that goes back to communication. Have we clearly identified what those are? And could everybody on the team, whether it's 5 or 30 people, repeat those as the same as you would? Or if you've got 5 people sitting around a table, or whether it's a virtual room or an in-person room, would they all be able to say what those same things are? But I digress a little bit from negotiation on that. But ultimately, the confidence comes from knowing that you know your audience, can position it in a way that benefits them. And then, of course, the other thing I would say just about confidence in general is for knowing that you are good enough at whatever thing you're doing. And now that, again, is not a very helpful tip to just say, well, just know that you're good enough. So I have a few tips around how to actually deal with that self-doubt. So I'd be happy to share a couple, but you let me know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect segue into that. Again, we're sort of talking about the confidence to get things started. So what are your 2 or 3 tips around that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, and in fact, this is funny because I followed my own advice the other day, and I was having a pretty rough day, kind of discouraging, one of those days when nothing seems to go right and feeling overwhelmed. And I had to remind myself that, oh yeah, there's this thing that I have that I recommend other people do too. It's called a celebration portfolio. It's simply a collection of nice words or cards that people have sent. And it could be, I have one electronically, and I also have one actually in a literal portfolio with those little plastic sleeves you can stick in thank you cards and that kind of thing. And it's a great thing to have at the ready for those days when you are not feeling very confident. And you can go back and read some of those wonderful things that people have said where you go, oh yeah, I do add value. I do provide a really great service, and people appreciate it, because when we're in our own head all the time, sometimes we're unable to see that. So that's one thing, is that celebration portfolio. And then another one that I find very helpful is all around your physical presence. So you and many of your audiences have probably heard of Amy Cuddy, who has a TED Talk on power poses. And the idea of simply physically standing for 2 minutes in a Superman or Superwoman pose can actually change your physiology. And then along with that, when you can actually say words, like, let's say you're not feeling like, oh, who am I? Like, I don't have the confidence or this, or I'm not good enough, to actually trick your brain on a neuroscience level to say, I am great enough. I'm not just good enough. I'm amazing. Or, whatever affirmation would be something that would resonate with anybody that's listening on a personal level. You've got to come up with something that works for you. But it's that what I find is fascinating about our physicality and our physiology is that they go together. So a lot of times, when we're depressed or we're just not feeling well, we sometimes even physically hunch over, or we make ourselves smaller. And when we can expand even our shoulders and our hands and make ourselves bigger, that, along with one of these amazing affirmations, can actually do something for your confidence, especially if you do it time and time again. It continues to show, get into those neural pathways of your brain to say, yeah, I actually start believing this now.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of my tips.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
So tell me, once a negotiation starts, and I know this is such an involved topic, but do you have some easy guidelines that people can keep in mind when they realize, oh, hang on, I'm negotiating here? What do people need to keep in mind to maximize the chances they're going to get the result that they're looking for?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people look at a negotiation as if it's one person wins and one person loses. And when I think about that just mindset from the beginning, that isn't a very productive mindset to walk into this with. And so the number one thing is to think about it as a relationship. I am building a relationship here. And if we can think about it from that perspective, that, hey, let's imagine this as a win-win collaboration conversation that we're walking into, rather than, I want to get this. I do think that when we think about it that way, and we think about coming to the table, being direct with our ask, but also coming from a place of service, how can I be of service to myself, to the world in this conversation? And that might sound a little bit lofty, but I do think that there is a lot of value that we don't think about from a mindset perspective before we walk into that. So I would start with remembering this is a relationship. And then the other thing that I would say is to be really clear on what you want, because when we are unclear, we can all waffle and waver. And I have been there, like the rest of anybody that is in this place, where maybe I thought I knew what I wanted, but then when somebody is particularly good at maybe their own, like somebody on the other side of the table might be really good at influence or convincing, however you want to say it, that it's easy to cave sometimes. So that's where it's really important to remember, hey, here's what I want, and here's the reason behind it. So when we can have more of the reasoning, and again, with our audience in mind, what matters to them, that can really be a huge deal breaker, but in a good, a impact maker, I should say, in that conversation, for sure.
Find it hard to define a clear strategy, then communicate it and execute it alongside the rest of your team? or you currently don't work, a simple quarterly strategic plan to boost your team's performance, our Business Growth Formula online course is perfect for small business owners with 5 to 30 team members wanting to grow. We share the mindsets, habits and tools to be a legendary leader in your business. growasmallbusiness.com.
Yeah, look, I think there are a couple of great bits of advice, and certainly being clear on what you want is, I mean, it sounds so obvious, but
Right.
it's so powerful when you're actually going into a discussion, being really intentional around, I guess, the outcome that you're shooting for. And I think your other point around, how can we mutually create value for each other here, tends to lead itself to being a little more creative with the solutions that you can come up with, rather than, like you say, I guess, thinking that it's a fixed outcome and one person wins, one person loses. I think that makes a lot of sense. Just going back to your point around being clear on what you want, and you sort of talked about the situations where you're in a negotiation and you may be finding yourself caving in. I mean, what sort of strategies can you use in that situation to recenter yourself? Is it a case where you might need to take some time out, or how would you approach that?
Yeah, well, the number one thing that I would recommend everybody do is to role play the conversation first. This is not something that a lot of people practice. And I know most of my clients, when they start working with me, and I say, okay, let's do a role play. And then they'll go, no. But then they love it afterward, because it's what I find fascinating about role plays is that when we do it in a role play, even though it's technically pretend, it to our subconscious mind, our subconscious brain doesn't know the difference. And so when we actually get to the real life scenario, your brain says, oh, I've been here before. So it's just fascinating. So that's what I would say first, is to role play it so that you can practice some of these scenarios, and even a couple of times. I mean, once would be better than nothing, but a couple of times is what I'd recommend. And then I think about owning your worth. And I'll give you an example, because this was not that long ago negotiation that I had where I was trying to win some business. And it was truly the most that I had ever actually declared out loud. And this is where I'm not a good example, Rob, of saying know what you want, because I remember thinking, I should probably know what I'm going to ask them, price wise, what I'm going to say as my fee. And then the funny thing is, just like what's happened with COVID, we can be making deals in the most bizarre places. And so I want everybody to picture that I was on my phone sitting on the stairs at a loading dock behind some random restaurant, because my husband had a doctor's appointment. It was during COVID. It was just one of those things where, I thought, okay, I literally have nowhere else to do this right now. And so I laugh, because a very lucrative deal was made on those stairs. And one of the things that I want to share with everybody is something that just came out of my mouth in that moment. And I thought, I need to teach this, but it's part of a bigger thing around knowing your worth and claiming your worth. So when I said the price, of course, there was that pause. And we all know we're supposed to pause when we negotiate. And usually what I say after a little bit of pause is the question, and here's a tip for everybody. This is one of my favorite questions, which is, how did that land for you? And in this case, she did say, wow, that's higher. We've been looking at X amount of dollars with the other speakers that we've been looking at. And what came out of my mouth, and this is what I want to recommend that everybody even just try on, is that I said, I recognize that I'm higher than most. And that's all I said. And that again, it's something, sometimes we just have to have that sentence prompt to know, okay, well, what could I say in that scenario? Because that sentence, again, I had never used it before. It came out of my mouth and it felt so good. And I do think it's part of a bigger picture where, as business owners, we need to be willing to step away from something and own the value of the pricing that we have put out there.
Yeah.
So I'd say that was a huge turning point for me, because I remember so significantly that I was okay walking away. And I actually said to her, do you want me to proceed with submitting a proposal, or am I too high for your company? And right away she goes, oh, no, I want you to submit a proposal. I mean, I'm a big believer that if it's going to work, we'll make it work. And so it was such an interesting example where I could have easily just said a lower number, or said, oh, I'm sorry, that might be too much,
Yeah.
all the things that we tend to say to backpedal.
Yeah, and that happens so often, and it's a real shame. Like you say, there's so many great people out there that, for whatever reason, don't own their worth and aren't getting paid what they should get paid, because they will tend to back down in that situation, rather than going, no, I'm worth it, and I'm prepared to walk away if somebody doesn't value me to the degree that I'm worth. So I think that's really powerful. So,
well, can I say something else there, Rob?
Yeah, of course.
Excuse me, because I'm thinking about the business owner that's listening to this, that maybe is fairly new or starting out and thinking, yeah, but how can I want to have the confidence to say my worth and walk away, but I can't afford it.
Yeah.
And if, so that's a reality too. So I wanted to acknowledge that in these cases where you're really saying, like, if we go with what I had recommended there, or what I did, I recognize I'm higher than most. And in this case, here's the other thing that I wanted to call out, which we've already talked about, but I had built a relationship in that phone call to where I felt like I already felt comfortable with the person. So I felt just really good about saying whatever I wanted to say, kind of having the thought that, if it's not going to work out, well, then that's okay. But what I would say to everybody is that if you say that, I don't think that that's going to be the be all end all and somebody's just going to hang up on you. I think you always have leverage if they say, oh my gosh, that's way too high. And even if you say, I recognize I'm higher than most, and then they say, but we can't afford that, you could say, well, I'm also happy to negotiate.
Yeah,
I do think that it's important to remember that you don't have to feel like you're missing out if you say something that you feel all good about, like, oh, I listened to Karen and now I'm going to do this. And then you go, but wait, what if they say no? That there's always a way to go back.
I guess, yeah, keep the door open sometimes is the right approach. So just to round this off, Karen, if you had to give a business owner one tip, and I know it's difficult to nail it down to one, that's going to help them with their confidence and their communication, particularly in a negotiation situation, what would that tip be? What can they do tomorrow?
Yes, I'm going to go with how to stop rambling and get to the point.
Right.
So the number one thing in communication, particularly in a negotiation, that I've noticed is people start talking too much or tripping over their words or saying too many words. So that clarity can then get lost. So if you notice you are rambling, and by the way, I say this as a recovering rambler myself. So I want everybody to know that I have been there and I get it. When you notice yourself rambling, you can pause and say out loud, and my point is this. When you pause and say those words out loud, it not only helps you focus and recalibrate back to your point, it helps your audience go, oh, she has a point, or, oh, he's getting there. Excellent. I've been waiting for this all day. So it's a very nice way to call yourself out, but also being really clear. You're not calling yourself out where you're self-sabotaging or you're apologizing. You're just saying, here's my point. And if you don't want to say that out loud, then my second tip would be simply to pause. In that second that you would pause, you can gather your thoughts and start back into what your actual point is.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. There's nothing worse than being stuck with a rambler. And again, speaking as someone who is guilty of it from time to time. So
understood.
I
Me
really
too.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, Karen, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where's the best place to find that? Do we Google you?
Yeah, you can Google me if you want, but my website is Karen, Karen Laos, Laos.com. And if you want to head to my website, there is a free PDF for you called 9 Words to Avoid and What to Say Instead. So a lot of people have found that helpful.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, Karen. And
You're welcome.
we'll look forward to negotiating more successfully based on your tips. So really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Rob.
Thank you.
And for our audience, we would greatly appreciate a review in iTunes or whatever platform you listen to us on. More reviews means we bubble up higher in iTunes, etc. So more business owners looking for podcasts to help with their growth will find us.